I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
We are Velocities in Music. On this podcast, Tom and I discuss a station of topics pertaining to modern music, including artist deep dives and monthly and annual new music wrap-ups. Before we get started, you can help support Velocities in Music. Subscribe to Velocities in Music on your favorite podcasting device to automatically get our latest episode sent to your device for your listening pleasure. Want to help Velocities in Music grow? You can. Velocities in Music was founded on the idea of creating an enriching discussion about modern music. Please share Velocities in Music with the music enthusiasts in your life. Together, we can move music discussion forward. Tom.
Yes.
4 weeks ago today. Well, it wasn't like exactly 4 weeks ago, but about 4 weeks ago, Major Tom, we recorded our first part, 9 albums of David Bowie, the artist deep dive.
It's a lot.
And we're returning today after much anticipation 4 weeks later. And I would have liked to not have been 4 weeks. But there was a lot of travel in there, a lot of life experience in there. And here we are in 1,500 miles apart, you in Iowa, me in Phoenix, Arizona. I want you to know it was almost 90 here today.
I want you to know that it wasn't here today.
So 4 weeks ago when we finished part 1, we ended on Bowie's 9th album, Young Americans, where we saw Bowie starting to change directions musically a little bit. And Station to Station, where we'll kick off part 2 today, we'll cover 8 albums in this podcast, Station to Station through Never Let Me Down. Tom.
Yes.
Can you give us some background about Station to Station? Where was Bowie at in this point in his career?
Bowie was in Los Angeles, so going from the kind of Philadelphia soul sound of Young Americans, we go from there across the United States to Los Angeles, where he records Station to Station in 1976. So some important context here. This is where we see David Bowie adopt yet another of his infamous personas. This time, it's the Thin White Duke, wearing nice black slacks and a white dress shirt, looking pale and gaunt with his hair slicked back. That is the Bowie persona of this album. And really, we call it a persona, but historically speaking, I think it's really just a very thin veil over really who he was at the time, because notoriously this album was his major cocaine album. We just got to put it out there. From what I've read, from interviews I've seen, he's basically recorded this album in Los Angeles in a whirlwind of cocaine. And him and several of the other musicians actually have noted that the recording sessions, the memories of these recording sessions are actually somewhat fuzzy being played back in their minds because they were so coked out the whole time. So that's quite a testament to the recording experience. But another sidestep from there that's worth mentioning is at the same time, he was working on a movie. He was in a feature film, The Man Who Fell to Earth, a very odd kind of off-kilter sci-fi film in which David Bowie plays an alien who comes down to Earth to become a rock star, essentially.
That's basically him.
It's basically his life. It's like an autobiography.
It is an autobiography.
Right. There's some more to the movie than that. He really goes there to try to save his planet and his family back on his dying planet.
Have you seen the movie?
I have, yeah. I watched it several years ago. It's really bizarre, and you see way too much of Rip Torn. That's all I'm going to say.
Oh, Rip Torn's in it, huh?
Yeah.
That's cool. I assume you need to be coked out of your mind to really get the movie.
There needs to be some kind of substance involved. Take your pick. But it's and if you're into odd, bizarre sci-fi films like I am, you might like it. But what's important to relate that back to Station, first off, not only that the album cover for this album and actually Low, the album we're going to talk about next, is a still frame from the movie. I think that the Thin White Duke persona was really an extension of his character in the film. He dresses similarly, he looks similar. That is part and parcel with the fact that they took the album cover from it, so he's kind of in that character. But really, that the character itself is kind of emotionally hollow, but very showy. It also is a continuation, or I should say like an evolution, or hell, perhaps even de-evolution from who he was on Young Americans. Young Americans was what's considered to be like his plastic soul phase, right? Where it's, skinny white guy singing Philadelphia soul. Well, he takes that and take it a step down into a darker, more emotionally devastated arena, but then put that character on a stage and make him act like he's happy and soulful. I think that really reflects where David was in his life. He was going through kind of a tough mental state, then in turn, going to drugs to help to cope with that. And that's kind of what comes through on this album, is that on the surface, it's very showy, it's very bright and exuberant, and there's a lot of movement, there's a lot of funk, there's a lot of progressive ideas here, but underneath it, there's just this kind of like oddly like kind of facade of Bowie's happiness that's being projected.
Yeah, it's definitely, it's kind of cliche to say that Station to Station is a transitional album, but it's very clear that Bowie didn't exactly know who he was when recording and writing the music that's on Station to Station. Mm-hmm. He, I don't think, it's hazy is the right word. Like it's these things, these tracks. I mean, first of all, it's an album that it has 6 tracks on it. Many of the tracks, the opening track is over 10 minutes long. There's only one track that's under 5 minutes on the album. Most of them are above 6. Mm-hmm. And they just go all over the place. There's no predominant song structures on any of the songs. Mm-hmm. And they're all based in this conceptual nature. They grow and evolve. They feel more like movements than traditional rock songs, even though they incorporate a lot of elements of Bowie's previous albums, specifically that funk plastic soul sound that was on Young Americans. You hear him kind of playing with, mm-hmm. mixing that direction with his traditional songwriting style, but also new styles like krautrock and getting into more electronic influences like Kraftwerk and things like that, which kind of as that transition into the Berlin period, which we'll talk about later in the podcast on the next 3 albums, you really hear him start to shift into a different mindset here. But to dig into the music, I think that, like, first of all, every song on this record I think is fantastic.
Yeah,
and
I agree.
Tom, this is a great time to point out the fact that we have done an excellent job of not talking to each other whatsoever about any of these albums. I haven't talked to you about any of these albums.
I know. I'm on the edge of my seat. I want to know what you think.
Yeah, before part 1, we had talked about a number of the albums because mm-hmm. we spent a lot of time getting ready for part 1. But this time, I feel like, we kind of just lightly listened to them and then just jammed in a bunch of listens over the past week to 2 mm-hmm. weeks. And we haven't had a chance to really catch up on any of these, which is good. I always like it when we're going into these things fresh. Mm-hmm. I love Station to Station.
I do too.
This is top tier David Bowie for
mm-hmm.
me, and it's because I'm an album listen guy. I like to put an album on and listen to it straight through without any hiccups, without any shitty, not just kind of trough tracks, I would call them, where they're just clearly filler. They don't hold up to the rest of the album. Station to Station doesn't have any of that. All 6 tracks on this album are amazing, and I also think it's amazing when an artist can have longer length tracks, 5, 6 minutes, 10 minutes is the title track, first track on the album, Station to Station, 10 minutes and 18 seconds, has this mm-hmm. really, really interesting start with a lot of sound effects and then transitions to this funky bass groove, and then about 5 minutes into the song, you get to the main chorus, which is this too late, and you hear all this this Elton John piano, and it's very upbeat and poppy, and that carries itself through the rest of the song. That is 10 minutes of Station to Station, the track. You don't get bored of it, and I think that's just an amazing way to open the album. Shows where he's at from a songwriting perspective, and he can do this in a coked out haze. I'm completely blown away.
It's Station to Station, the title track, is David Bowie's longest track in his discography, and it is my favorite. My single favorite David Bowie song.
Are you serious?
I am.
All his songs.
So
even more than 5 years.
5 years is my number 2.
Oh, so of course it is.
Close second. But Station to Station as a track just blows me away with the guitar noise that starts it off and just this slow, sinister, plodding groove. Into just the straight up, like, coked out funk of the last half.
It's not the side effects of the cocaine. I'm thinking that it must be long. It's too late to be grateful.
It's an incredible track. And Jake, you hit the nail on the head. I think we're in agreement on this album in general.
Yeah, we are.
Every track is good. Honestly, the first 5 tracks, so all of them except for the closing track, Wild is the Wind, the first 5 tracks, I would put all of them in my top 10 David Bowie songs. Like,
You don't like Wild as the Wind?
Wild as the Wind is fine, but to me, it's the low point of the album. It's also a cover, so I think it works well as a closer, but those first 5 tracks are just straight unrelenting fire. And you'd think, being that this single album occupies like half of my top 10 David Bowie tracks, you'd think it'd make a case as my favorite Bowie album. And I'll tell you what, when I'm listening to it, I get so wrapped up in it that I think it is. But then I listen to Hunky Dory or Ziggy Stardust again, and I put this one at a solid number 3 underneath those two. This is my third favorite David Bowie album, but really, I think it's the one that I actually enjoy the most. I respect the songwriting and just the craftsmanship on Ziggy Stardust and Hunky Dory a bit more, but like this one is my go-to just fun listening David Bowie album because it just doesn't let up. Right after the title track, you go straight into Golden Years, which is one of his most well-known songs, and for good reason.
I'll stick with you, baby, for 1,000 years. Nothing's gonna touch you in these golden years.
Just a really good, upbeat, feel-good track. Tremendous.
Got that funky bass groove.
Yeah, man, and it's got a great vocal performance. Word on a Wing gets a little bit more sentimental. And then TVC15 and Stay as back-to-back.
I love
just
TVC15.
Holy crap.
I had TVC15 stuck in my head all day today, and it was awesome.
They're funky and groovy as hell,
Yeah.
but they also have this rock edge and attitude. I get a strong prog rock kind of feel from this. Jake, you mentioned krautrock as well, and that's a really important element and aspect at this time. But I also think it's worth noting, 1976, this is kind of the height of prog rock with bands like Pink Floyd, yes, King Crimson, who'd been around. Rush is really starting to get progressive around this time. And actually, it's right before 1977 hits, which is when punk starts to take over, and all of a sudden, long 10-minute tracks aren't really cool anymore. Like, I think David Bowie was right there with it with Station to Station. It doesn't feel like a prog rock album per se, but structurally and conceptually, the way the songs flow with only 6 tracks, it feels like that. But man, by the time you get to Stay, that is just one of the stone-cold, funkiest songs I've ever heard. And when it just jams out at the end, you got nice congas going in the background, which I think is an underutilized instrument. And there's just this nice, like, chromatic ascending bass line that comes in just like the last 4 repeats as the song fades out, and it just gets, oh my god, it gets my whole body moving every time. I just want to dance thinking about it.
I definitely agree with that. I also, I understand what you said about Wild as the Wind as the closing track, but, it's a little bit more of this electric guitar kind of morose ballad to close. Mm-hmm. And I really actually like this as a closer, considering how far you've come on this audio journey on Station to Station. And I also think that it really highlights a shift in David Bowie's vocal style on this record. Yeah. He's singing so much more emphatically. He's belting everything. It's so emotional. Mm-hmm. Like, you just hear him pouring his heart and soul into his vocals, which, earlier on in his career, I don't think he was that great of a vocalist, but he really evolved over the course of his first 10 albums. Station to Station being his 10th solo album. Man, his vocals are top notch by this point. He really shows it off on Station to Station.
Yeah, he does. And I think that a great example of that is Golden Years, because that is the one song on this album that I feel like in writing, in spirit, would have fit the best on Young Americans. Like that's the overlap. That's where you see, okay, there's still some common threads here with what he was doing on his previous album. But Golden Years, you're absolutely right, Jake. He's putting so much more feeling into his vocal performance, where Young Americans, he was trying really hard to be smooth and sultry and kind of fake, like it feels contrived. On Station to Station, it feels very natural, which is really a pretty amazing achievement considering apparently these guys were all just out of their minds when they were recording it. Some notable appearances, though, in the instrumentals, we have Earl Slick on the guitar, who's responsible for a lot of just the edge and attitude and guitar noise that we hear on some of these tracks, such as the intro to the title track and the intro to the album. This is also where we see Dennis Davis on the drums being joined by George Murray on bass, and that rhythm section is important because it would actually, they would play on the rest of Bowie's albums for the next 5 years, which he puts out several more albums in the next 5 years. And that's really the only common thread that's present within his, within this part of his career. He's changing constantly, but I think having that rhythm section be the consistent heart of the band aspect of David Bowie is a really important piece.
Moving on from Station to Station, we return to David Bowie's 11th studio album in 1977, which, by the way, this guy is so prolific. Every year he's putting out a new amazing record. 1977 begins his Berlin trilogy, which we'll explain what that is here in a second. This album is called Low, and it's a very different take on Bowie. We mentioned Station to Station being more of a transitional piece in both David Bowie's life, living in LA and now moving to Berlin, hence why they call it the Berlin trilogy, and recording and putting out his first album of a kind of a different musical style, and that's Low. Now, when we talk about how Bowie and he changes his musical style, and if you read a lot of music reviews like Tom and I do, you'll read a lot of music reviewers make it seem like David Bowie changes his style completely on every single album, and that's simply not true.
Yeah.
You can hear, if you listen to his albums chronologically, the biggest shift is between his first self-titled album and then what he did in his first few up through Hunky Dory. After that, it's just incremental changes, if you ask me. And I think that the biggest change that we see between Station to Station and Low is, if anything, in a little bit of the sonic composition and some of the choices he made there. But really it was in the album structure.
Yeah.
Half of this album is very short tracks, under 3 minutes or three-ish minutes or under. And that's the first album, half of the album, with vocals on the first half. And the second half is more experimental tracks. Very much, if there are vocals, they are very minimalized and usually do not include lyrics. They're just vocal effects, some singing or chanting or things like that on the second half. It's a very different approach to an album. But to give you some background on this record, I'll toss it over to Tom, who is our in-house music historian and very bashful, but knows so much about every one of these records.
So, well, I think you gave a lot of the noteworthy context there, Jake, in that David Bowie had to get out of Los Angeles. He ended up going to Berlin. He ended up living with Iggy Pop for a while and working with him. He also brought in Brian Eno, who collaborated very closely with him on the Berlin trilogy, quote-unquote, albums. One thing worth noting, it's commonly and mistakenly said that Brian Eno produced these albums. That is not true. They were produced by Tony Visconti. Again, you remember him as a previous collaborator, played bass and produced on Man Who Sold the World, and was kind of a just frequent collaborator here and there while also working on some other musical projects. So on Low, he's working with a new group of people in a new place. He's got a new career in a new town, you might say.
That's funny.
Anyway, not even really true, but I just had to slip that joke in there. But what I think, Jake, you mentioned a really good point about the fact that really his musical changes were very incremental. And at this point in his career, I think what makes a bigger impact on his sound isn't the changes that we see in Bowie, it's the changes in the cast of characters he chooses to surround himself with. That's really key. I think that having Tony Visconti on production and having Brian Eno there as just kind of a general guru and helping him with this like ambient side B of this album is really way bigger than any musical changes that were going on in Bowie, because actually he had started working on some of the kind of fledgling ideas for what would become the album Low while he was still in Los Angeles. He was working on the movie The Man Who Fell to Earth, was under the impression that he would be doing the soundtrack for it, and started putting some of these pieces together. Found out he wouldn't be doing the soundtrack for it, but still took that direction and turned it into Low. Now, someone on our part 1 deep dive, Jake, on YouTube commented and called me out because I said when we were talking about Hunky Dory, I said that Hunky Dory is the most Bowie album, the most like him being himself. And this commenter said, I'm paraphrasing, but essentially called BS on me and said, no, that's Low. Low is the album where he's being the most himself. And I can see why. I would argue still that Hunky Dory is the most Bowie as Bowie the songwriter, but I think that Low makes sense as a very honest, open, raw, artistic, experimental statement, kind of Bowie shedding away the outer layers into his core weirdness, right? Like we've started to see some the writing on the wall. We've seen some shadows of that in his previous albums, but I think Low is really when he really just goes off the deep end, and he's already there in Germany, and he takes the feelings that he's getting there and some of his German musical influences and puts it into this just weird experimental album. They were also doing a lot of experimental stuff in the production. Tony Visconti was using an Eventide harmonizer, which at the time was a really kind of revolutionary bit of equipment that, to geek out for a moment, Jake, so what it does is it is able to adjust the pitch and frequency basically of things without changing the timing of it. And that's kind of a big deal at the time, because really in previous recording technique and a lot of like standard analog equipment, what would end up happening is the only way to change the pitch is to change the speed. And if you change the speed, you change the pitch. The two go hand in hand, right? Because waves going faster is a higher frequency and a higher pitch. We heard the Beatles taking advantage of this in the 60s. Right. The solo in My Life was actually recorded at half speed and then played back at double speed and thus brought an octave up. When I'm 64, the entire track was played back faster, so it raised in pitch slightly. It's the same thing that we see if we change our record player from 33 1/3 to 45 RPM, right? All of a sudden, the pitch gets jacked up. Well, this piece of equipment basically is able to adjust the pitch without having it mess with the time as much, and they use that on the drum sound of Low. And that's why Low has this really, really remarkable and noteworthy, like, kind of boxy and strange like sound. It's not quite like the gated drum sound that we'd hear a lot in the 80s on like Phil Collins and Peter Gabriel records. But it, you think about like the snare sound on Low, and it's like kind of lower pitched and like and morphed in a way that a natural snare doesn't sound like. But that was really revolutionary at the time. Tony Visconti actually had a lot of producers calling him, asking him how he got this sound, because they messed with this a lot. And I think that just goes to show the general attitude they had while working on this album was one of, nothing's off the table. Let's try some stuff out. But still, they were able to make it into a pretty just good, solid rock album. I mean, the first half, those songs, they move along at such a quick pace. Jake, you mentioned that they're, 2 to 3 minutes on average. I want to call out track 2, Breaking Glass, which is a highlight for me. That song is like 1 minute and 50 seconds long, and it's so memorable. They pack so much into that time with that sleazy lead guitar line. I love it. That whole slew of songs never lets up and never disappoints. And then side 2 is such a more like almost spiritual ambient experience that is hugely Eno influenced. So it kind of leads this dual life, but it all works really well together.
Yeah, to me, it's very much two albums kind of compressed in one. And spoiler alert, we'll hear the same thing on Heroes. But, the first half of this album is so damn good. It's really hard for me to pick tracks on this album because it really does play to me like two separate albums. You can visualize the record and the different sides of the record and what you're experiencing on each side. And all of my favorite tracks would be on the A side of the album. Breaking Glass, Sound and Vision, Always Crashing in the Same Car, and Be My Wife are my four favorite tracks on this record. I really enjoy the second half as this more, you get these dreamy synths and a lot of synth-based instrumentals. You get some of the tribal vocals going on, very spacey sounding. And I really like just a lot of the experimental exploration that Bowie and Eno are doing. I think it works really well. One thing I want to give Bowie credit for is he sings less on this album, whereas on Station to Station he was belting out his vocals. It was still very much like it was like a vocal highlight. Even on the half where there are a lot of predominant vocals on this record, he's singing less on average than what he has done on his more recent records up to this point. And I really think that is a very smart songwriting craft choice. It shows how good David Bowie is as a songwriter. And really all of the albums up until some of his 80s albums that we're going to talk about, at least on this part of the deep dive, are so incredibly thick in their composition. There are so many layers of noise on every one of these tracks. There's so much going on. If you are a music head that likes to dig into the sound and pull out all the different layers, man, there's a lot to get through here. And to be honest, like all of these records, especially Low, took me at least 5, if not 7 listens to really fully feel like I understood it. And that to me is always a very rewarding experience whenever an album is that complicated and well constructed, because all of it really comes off as beautiful. The whole point of the sound of Low is to be experimental, spacey, and chaotic, yet somehow it manages to convey very, very impactful melody, and the result is really quite beautiful. So, I really like Low. This is not one of my top tier favorite Bowie albums, but I really, really enjoy this one.
Yeah, I like it a lot. It's my 4th favorite underneath Station to Station at number 3. So
you did come
down.
prepared.
Yeah. I like this one a lot. This is one that I've been listening to longer than a lot of others in his discography. I keep coming back to it. And yeah, first it was really challenging, but like you said, Jake, I found it to be really rewarding in the end. Going to the second album in the Berlin Trilogy and the first album of 2 that David Bowie will release in the year 1977. 2 of the reasons the 1977 is one of my favorite years in music. It's an incredible year. Side note, we have David Bowie's album Heroes. And Heroes actually is the only album in the Berlin Trilogy that was entirely recorded in Germany, because the 2 albums that sandwich it were kind of, Lodger, which we'll get to, was kind of started there and finished elsewhere, and then Low was kind of started elsewhere and finished in Germany. But we're continuing to see David Bowie experiment, continuing to see him influenced by krautrock and German culture, German music. They actually recorded this album in a studio that you could see the Berlin Wall from. And that atmosphere really inspired them a lot. We see some more like positive vibes creep into this album, and a little bit more personality, but it's still, it's still kind of an odd experimental album. Still have that Brian Eno influence. As far as the band goes, we still got Dennis Davis and George Murray. We still got Carlos Alomar on guitar, but we have the exciting addition of Robert freaking Fripp of King Crimson, prog rock guitar god and legend of ages. And Brian Eno, I guess, called him up and asked him to come join them, and he did.
Basically, you have like a late 1970s supergroup operating under the pseudonym of David Bowie,
right? And a few years,
which I didn't realize before like preparing for this. I didn't realize how amazing the cast list here
Yeah,
is.
he surrounded himself with an all-star cast, and David Bowie and Brian Eno and Robert Fripp had put out an album together, No Pussyfooting, a few years before. So I think that's where that connection comes into play. And Eno having recently done a lot of solo work and leaving Roxy Music and so on. You just have all these people who are at this creative peak, but also I think in a little bit of an identity crisis because Robert Fripp wasn't doing quite as much with King Crimson at the time. Brian Eno wasn't exactly in a band at the time. David Bowie has always just been kind of nomadic, free-spirited David Bowie.
David Bowie.
So they all get together under Tony Visconti's production and make another solid album. Now, to dive right into the music here, Jake, I'm gonna be upfront about this. This one I actually struggle with a lot.
I do too.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, so glad you're my friend.
I felt bad because I'm like, this one's not as good.
It's not, and it's odd because in doing my research, I feel like it's acclaimed at about the same level as Low,
right.
And I just don't think it's
should
nearly
be.
as good.
Well, it's to me from like what I've interpreted, and who knows, because I feel like this changes by the day and who you talk to. But like I feel like this, like Station to Station, Low, and Heroes, like I originally thought that was the Berlin trilogy, and then when digging into this, realized, oh no, that's wrong. It's Low, Heroes, and then the next album, which we'll talk about, Lodger, and Heroes to me, like of any of all of these records, like I really struggle with this one. And Tom, I'll toss it back to you here in a second, but I'll say why really quick. Realistically, it's just a simple matter of there's only 2 tracks on here that really get me very excited, and that's the title track, Heroes, which is quite poppy, even though it's doing a lot of very kind of prog rock sort of David Bowie things that you would expect from a David Bowie album in 1977.
If your other track pick is the same, because I feel the same way. I got 2 songs that I really like, and that's about it. If your pick is the same as mine, I'm gonna freak out.
Mine is the other one. I do like Joe the Lion, but my other pick is Son of the Silent Age.
Yeah, we are exactly the same on this album. I can't believe it.
Sons of the silent age stand on platforms, blank books and notebooks, sit in back rows.
Yeah, and then like Blackout is okay. I mean, it's really just a kind of a station to station song with a little bit more of a Low production style. But then the second half, I said earlier, like Low, Heroes. Is all instrumentals on the second half. It starts off the second half, track 6 with V2 Schneider, and that sounds like it could be interesting. And technically, there are vocals and lyrics where David Bowie very slowly sings in layered octaves of V2 Schneider.
Yeah,
it's kind of upbeat, but I honestly just don't feel like it's one of the stronger tracks.
No, I like the bass groove. But
exactly.
That's about it.
It's interesting, but it's not compelling, is how I would describe it. And then the next 2 tracks, Sense of Doubt and Moss Garden. Sense of Doubt is very dark sounding. It's an instrumental track, very much a perfect track title for the sound that he's going for there. And that track flows perfectly into Moss Garden. And it's very hard to tell where Sense of Doubt ends and Moss Garden begins. And Moss Garden is a much more uplifting, optimistic sound. Those 2 pieces kind of work together. And I think that that's really cool. But at the same time, it's like this album doesn't seem to have an identity. It has lots of very small mini identities throughout, like on the track Heroes or on the track Joe the Lion, or the combination of Sense of Doubt or Moss Garden. The closing, the last couple of tracks, Newcoln, I don't know how to say it, it's just kind of some spacey explorations. And the very last track, The Secret Life of Arabia, honestly just didn't do very much for me.
Yeah.
So this one to me was very hit or miss. It was definitely suffered from some track disparity. I will say that I really did appreciate how David Bowie, and I think that this is the krautrock influence taking over a little bit more, but there's a lot of subtle builds on this record. The songs as they play out tend to build towards the end, and in general I'm in favor of that song structure. It really kind of shows craft. But realistically, that I struggle to find things that I really love about this album.
Yeah, I totally get you. I think I have a few more positive things to say. First off, being that, V2 Schneider, I agree with you. Like, it sounds kind of cool, but it doesn't accomplish a lot. I think it's kind of a cool shout out to Florian Schneider of Kraftwerk as a big influence on this album. I also do like that, in comparing this to Low, the back half as being like, once again, the kind of experimental, more ambient and instrumental half of the album. I kind of like that the first track on side 2, V2 Schneider, still has some vocals, even if it's just the title of the song being sung, and that the last track, The Secret Life of Arabia, brings back in some vocals. I agree that that song to me is not all that captivating, but I like that it ends the album on a slightly more energetic note, and also calls out some things that we're going to be seeing him do on Lodger with more of the world music influence, which then also, we'd see Brian Eno taking over to his work with David Byrne on My Life in the Bush of Ghosts, and we'd see him take over to his work with the Talking Heads on Remain in Light. The seed is planted and it just grows from there. But Heroes as the title track, first off, I got to call out that the name of the song and the name of the album are in quotes and are meant to be kind of like a slightly sarcastic, cynical look at what the concept of heroism is. And I think it's interesting that Bowie decided to make that little stylistic nuance in there. It kind of, if you do notice it, it forces you to listen to the song in a slightly different context. I also want to get into a little bit of detail on his vocal performance on the title track, because this is a 6-minute song, and the whole first half of the song, he sings fairly in kind of like a blasé speak singing kind of manner. It sounds like something more like Lou Reed or Iggy Pop would do. No surprise, he's working with Iggy Pop a lot on this slew of albums and even living with him. But I also thought of Laurie Anderson in terms of vocal performance, but she hadn't even released an album yet, so I wouldn't consider that an influence. But in that kind of style. And at first I'm like, that's kind of an odd choice that he's choosing to be so blasé. He could sing this more impassioned and put a little more melody and sustain into his vocal performance there, and I think it'd have a bigger impact. But it all becomes justified when he goes through that last verse and chorus in the song where he is just absolutely belting it. I mean, just huge, desperate, emotional. And I think the contrast that he's creating between the first half of the song and that end vocal performance creates so much more impact in it. So I think that was actually a cool stylistic choice. Jake, I'm with you on this album. This one, I appreciate for its experimentalism, and also, David Bowie was using throughout this whole set of albums, Brian Eno's like oblique strategies cards and finding ways to improvise.
What is that?
It's a set of cards and kind of like a.
It's not a set of exercises, is it? Obliques?
No. Mental exercises.
Okay.
To test your metaphysical obliques. No, it's basically just a series of kind of thought exercises, I would say, that's meant to try to get creative people out of like writer's blocks and things. So David Bowie was using this to kind of do something different. It was causing some improvisation, like on like Joe the Lion, for example. Most of that song was written and recorded like right as he was doing it. I mean, right on the spot. And honestly, I think you can tell this album just doesn't feel as deliberate and as well put together. And I think it still turned out pretty damn good for what it is, considering that. And I think that's why people respect this so much, is because of its attitude and because of the process that went into it and what was accomplished from an experimental standpoint. But I think as an album, I just think that David Bowie is a little bit better when he takes more time puts more thought and deliberation into things, because this, to me, as a listening experience, just doesn't quite accomplish the same magnitude as a lot of the albums surrounding it. So in 1978, like the 1 year that David Bowie didn't put out a studio album in the 70s, he did put out a live LP called Stage.
His fans had to be just absolutely flabbergasted. Yeah, what is going on? David Bowie hasn't put out a full-length album.
It's been
this
like
year.
8 months, man. What are you doing?
How am I supposed to survive?
Right. It's interesting, the track list that he chose for this album though, and this live show, because he starts it out with stuff back from the Ziggy Stardust days, and then goes more into the Station to Station, Young Americans, Low, and Heroes stage, which I have to, listening to this, like, it makes for kind of an odd listening experience, but that's also David Bowie. I mean, he was a great performer, but he was also more of a studio mind. I think that's where he really flourished. So trying to take all of his ideas and mash them together into one live album is always going to make for a little bit of a disconnected experience, but still an interesting kind of time capsule or consolidation of what he had done in his career up to there, and some of the highlights. But from there, we won't spend too much time on the live albums. We'll keep trucking with the studio discography and move on to David Bowie's 13th studio album, which is Lodger, the final album in the Berlin Trilogy.
The last of the Berlin Trilogy. And this is the one I was not familiar with before preparing this podcast, I will admit.
I think I had listened to it like once, but after preparing for this, I found that once or twice is not enough with this album. This album, of this entire set, this is probably the album that took me the most listens to really understand.
I agree with that very, very much. And the reason for that is because I think that this, when we were talking about one of the previous records, we talked about how much David Bowie, when he goes to construct his music, how many different layers there are that you can peel back from, and all the different tracks that you can hear in the mix. And I think that reaches a true peak on Lodger. Lodger is incredible how much sound is packed into every one of these 10 tracks. And more than anything, if you like guitar, and Lodger is known of the Berlin Trilogy, it's known as the album that is the most accessible of the three, and I can understand why. First of all, it doesn't have that side A, side B divide of actual songs versus more instrumental and ambient songs. It's all one cohesive piece of work, and it's very much a rock album. Yeah, it takes all the sonic motifs and a lot of the influences that you heard on the two previous albums in the Berlin Trilogy of Low and Heroes, and you hear a lot of that same stuff happening in the songwriting in Lodger. But what's new on this record is almost every one of these tracks has at least 3 layers of guitar, if not 4, sometimes 5. There were several times when I was taking notes over some of these songs, especially some of the more rock-based songs, which talk about that in a second. There's at least 3 layers of electric guitar doing just crazy shit on the electric guitar, whether it's effects guitar or some soloing or doing all sorts of stuff. Like, it's not uncommon to have 2 rhythm electric guitars going at once over an acoustic guitar playing some sort of rhythm with an effects electric guitar and a lead electric guitar all participating on the same song at once. Yeah. Like, just talking about that makes my brain hurt, trying to listen to it, and yet it still sounds really, really good.
It does. And I've got a couple comments from there. So first off, you're absolutely right that from a sound perspective, from a style perspective, this is far more accessible than Lower Heroes. However, I, at least as a listener, had a way harder time wrapping my head around it, just because these songs make no sense together. I mean, this album jumps around so much. While Low and Heroes were much more experimental, at least there was more consistency. The first half of Low and then the second half of Low, it's like, whoa, I had to do a whole brain change in between flipping sides there. But at least you can understand both of those sides pretty quickly. With this album, it kind of goes all over the place, and a lot of that is because there's so much style injected into this. You have some world music influence coming into it with like African Night Flight and Yassassin, which has like this Turkish reggae vibe. And then it goes into more just kind of driving rock stuff and also like kind of a post-punk, kind of a new wave, like predecessor to Britpop even kind of sound in the rock vibes. But the guitar that you mentioned, Jake, so rather than having Robert Fripp on this album like he was on Heroes, they have Adrian Belew, who would go on to work with Robert Fripp as being another staple member of King Crimson in the 80s. But Adrian Belew was a guitar master and a huge influence on the sound here. Keep in mind, too, that he's still got Carlos Alomar on the guitar, who's been working with him for the past several albums and has a really good just groove and connection with David Bowie, knows how to portray his ideas. So it's interesting that Carlos has been there like this whole time, while David's also brought in these like A-list lead guitarists on these albums. And I think that's why Lodger is so guitar heavy, is just because, once again, the people he's surrounded himself with and the songwriting direction that he's taking just has a much more rock-oriented, track-by-track kind of approach.
It really reminds me of like how an NFL team, I'm going to make a football comparison to music. That always goes over well. It reminds me of how an NFL team, because like to me, the guitarist is equivalent to the wide receiver position. It's a skill position. It can make or break your team or your band, your sound. And a lot of teams will have like a lot of talent at wide receiver, and similar to how a lot of artists will have a lot of talent in the guitar position, and they'll still go out and get these big name free agents to come in and play for like a couple seasons, and they absolutely just kill it because it adds a whole new dynamic to the sound, a whole new thing to listen to. It adds this edge that it makes it completely interesting in terms of music and completely indefendable in terms of football. That's a horrible comparison unless you're like me and a music nerd and a football nerd, which I realize doesn't happen. But trust me, the analogy, I believe, holds.
So my contribution to this analogy is that I would nominate Brian Eno as the special teams coach.
Yeah.
Do you think that's
maybe
accurate?
Maybe more. I would go like offensive coordinator.
Okay. I'm sorry.
I would go offensive coordinator. Bowie's obviously Aaron Rodgers.
I love how you're not just...
He's the thin white Duke, motherfucker.
I love how you're not just giving him like a role, you're making him an actual person. You're not saying he's the quarterback, you're saying he's specifically Aaron Rodgers.
Tom, he's the fucking GOAT, all right?
I will take your word for it, as I so often do.
Have fun editing that out.
No, I'm probably going to keep most of that in. Anyway, this album to me, I struggled with a lot. As I said, it took me a lot of listens to wrap my head around. By the end, by tonight, I actually like this album a lot. I will find myself coming back to this. While it doesn't really have any individual tracks that I just go nuts over, I do like the back half a little bit more than the front half.
Really?
Yeah. In songs like Look Back in Anger and Boys Keep Swinging. Also the closing track, Red Money, I think is just has a great groove to it, a great energy. Another one he worked on with Iggy Pop. Look Back in Anger and Boys Keep Swinging, I think, is interesting that those are side to side on this album, because both of those have analogies to the Britpop of the mid-90s. Look Back in Anger as an inspiration for the Oasis song Don't Look Back in Anger. And then Boys Keep Swinging, Blur actually pulled from that song for their song MOR from Blur's self-titled album. They actually...
I didn't know that. In my notes, I have written under Boys Keep Swinging, this could be a Blur song.
Yeah. Oh, no, they actually had to give David Bowie songwriting credit on that song because they specifically pulled the "We're Working Out" and like the melody and the chord progression from that song.
Boys keep swinging, boys always work it out. gauge the colors.
I totally get it. I mean, I think Blur. I think Blur in particular, and you would know more about Oasis. I try not to listen to Oasis, but Blur in particular took so much from the sound of Lodger.
Oh yeah,
that it just blew my mind listening to this. And similarly similarly to how I felt on Blur on albums like Park Life and The Great Escape and even self-titled, where there's all these layers of noise going on and pulling them apart. Like that is Lodger, and if anything, I think Lodger is a great example of how much an album title and an album cover matter. This album cover, I am just personally not a fan of. I realize he got some artists to do the artwork for this, but I just don't like it. It's not compelling to me in a way that makes me like think about the music any differently. I just think it kind of looks cheap,
which really has been important with David Bowie's last few albums. I think
it has. It has, like the album covers. I think throughout David Bowie's discography, that the album covers have been important.
Yeah.
And the title Lodger is not a word that is A, common, and B, and to give some background here, this is a concept record, and the lyrics, one of the things I love about Lodger is the lyrics play a bigger role on this record than I think they have in some of the previous records. Low is very introspective, but I have this thing for concept albums with characters and stories and things like that, and Lodger has that, and Lodger represents some of the things going on there. So I understand why it's called Lodger. I personally just don't think that that's that appealing of a name. You know, there's something I think to the aesthetic nature of a word, and Lodger just isn't very aesthetically pleasing, like the word cellar or twin. Twin's my favorite word. Just gonna throw that out there. Anyways, I really do. I think that stuff matters, and I think that artists need to take. Tom, we were talking about this with your music the other night. Like, I think artists need to take that into consideration when designing the experience of the record, which is more than just the music, right? It's the whole package. It's the artwork. It's the name of the tracks. It's the stuff you put in your liner, in your sleeve. It's all of that stuff. That's all what goes into make an album experience, and Lodger is no different. So I do think it suffers because of that, which is a really trite thing to criticize it on, but that's about all I can criticize about Lodger. I think this record is damn near perfect. I'm gonna say it. This is my favorite record of this set.
Really?
This is my favorite record of this set.
I love it.
I would put this up there with some of the albums from the first set, like Aladdin Sane and Diamond Dogs, which I loved. I think Ziggy Stardust and Hunky Dory are in a tier of their own, and then after that, it's like Diamond Dogs, Aladdin Sane, and Lodger to me. And then there's a little bit of a gap before you get to some of his other records.
I'm glad that you liked this one so much. You know,
I love this record.
I ended up liking it a lot too, and it's funny because when the first couple listens I gave to it, I was very unaffected and just empathetic towards it, apathetic.
Yeah. No, me too, dude. And seriously, like I had to listen to this one. Like it wasn't until like listen 6 that it clicked with me, and I'm just sitting here dancing on every one of them. I do kind of like the smorgasbord of styles, and yet somehow it all feels like it fits under one sonic motif.
Yeah.
African Night Flight track 2, you know, it's one of those two worldly songs that you mentioned. Borderline Captain Beefheart, but then 4 of my favorite tracks are right in a row with Move On track 3, The Assassin, the otherworldly feel, has a very funky feel to it. Talking Heads, strong Talking Heads vibe. I hear a lot of Talking Heads on this record. Go ahead.
Go. No, you go. You're on a roll.
And there was like, you start to hear another thing on Lodger that I really like is you start to hear Bowie, but there's far less amount of synth use on Lodger and more use of strings. And maybe it's just my layman ears, but I think they're real strings as opposed to synth strings. So take that for what you will. But I like the tactful use of strings for some thickening and emphasis on this. And then track 5 and 6 are like 2 of my favorite Bowie songs with Red Sails and then DJ. DJ is a Talking Head song. It has to be. And David Byrne is singing
That's
there.
what I was going to say too. The first time I put this on, preparing for this set, and got to that song, when the vocals came in right at the beginning, I was like, did I accidentally put a Talking Head song on? It sounds exactly like Dave. And right from this era too, like Fear of Music,
absolutely.
Remain in Light era.
I'm home, lost my job, and incurably ill. You think this is easy? Really?
So after Lodger, which concluded the Berlin trilogy, and it obviously, kind of showed Bowie shifting out of that more experimental range into incorporating more guitars and going back to traditional album and song structures in that kind of more rock-based format. We enter the 1980s, and David Bowie releases his 14th studio record called Scary Monsters. Now, there's a song on this record called Scary Monsters and Super Creeps. I think the album is technically titled Scary Monsters, but I'm sure that I'm wrong. Everyone just calls this album Scary Monsters and
there's
Super
dispute
Creeps.
over that. It's fairly ambiguous.
And let's face it, Scary Monsters and Super Creeps is a great album title, so let's just roll with that.
All right.
Let's just roll with that.
All right.
Scary Monsters and Super Creeps is kind of known as like the last truly great David Bowie album. And if you think about it, starting with Space Oddity on, he really didn't put out anything that was even close to like average. Like everything was above average, and if you take out Pin-Ups, his cover album, and if you take out Young Americans, which I think is pretty good, but not great. I mean, he pretty much didn't release anything that wasn't pretty stellar.
Yeah.
After that, like all albums, I think you could make a strong case for one of his best. If you were to come to me and argue, yeah, this is his best album, I would struggle to argue with you. Scary Monsters and Super Creeps, I know we have friends, Tom, who this is their favorite Bowie album, and.
Yep.
And I think that it definitely warrants that. It takes kind of, I'd say if to sum this album up, Scary Monsters and Super Creeps takes all of Bowie from his 70s, his early 70s work during the Ziggy Stardust era, and then the more experimental stuff that he did in the Berlin trilogy, specifically leaning most heavily on the sound of Lodger with that multiple electric guitar line attack, and kind of makes his culmination album here. I think that this is the album that culminates and sums up his entire career. It also brings back the guitar legend Robert Fripp, and I will say that this album is my second favorite of this entire set, just behind Lodger, and it's because of the guitar. The guitar game is just top notch on Scary Monsters, and Robert Fripp is a god and shows it off on this record.
What I love about his sound too is while he's obviously primarily known as a prog rock guitarist, the way that he fits into Bowie's sound on this album, he almost takes more of like an edgy post-punk approach. He's got this really like quick boxy reverb sound on his guitar that just gives it this kind of unnatural, kind of creepy vibe, and I think it fits a lot with this album. It just puts so much edge into it. This one, Jake, I ended up really liking a lot, and next to Lodger, it was the one that was the next most difficult to wrap my head around, because
and I think that's because of the thick production and that thick composition.
Exactly. It's so dense. And it's so track by track that I can't rely, not that it doesn't still have a consistent sound, it does. I think that this albumizes well, especially with the bookends, It's No Game number 1 and number 2, to provide a little bit of larger context to it. But still, each track certainly has its own identity, and they don't necessarily rely on each other. Each track is a great standalone highlight. And albums like that, to me, just take a little more time because I can't rely on the previous track to necessarily provide me context or tell me where the album's going to go, right? So on this album, it was really a matter of getting to know each track individually, then looking at the track list holistically and understanding what it was. And that's when it hit me. I was like, damn, this is actually a really good album. And this was one that I wasn't overly familiar with before. So this was kind of my big gem of a takeaway, Station to Station and Low had been up there in the Bowie ranks for me for a long time, but other than those two, this was my favorite from this set. The Fripp influence on this album is huge, obviously. It's taking some of those big, thick drum sounds that we heard, actually, I think a little bit closer in sound to like Low and Heroes, but the big departure here is actually it's a slight departure back to the mainstream. You don't think as going to the mainstream as a departure, but with the Berlin trilogy, he was so experimental that he wasn't as commercially successful with those albums. I think it was an important venture in finding himself, but he notably wanted to make something a little more commercially successful, and he did. This album went to number 1, and I think that this album to me marks, since Ziggy Stardust, the best balance of commercial mainstream success with great artistic experimentalism and expression.
I completely agree with that.
It's a great overlap. Like, he's able to balance both of those elements in a way that not a lot of artists will ever or have ever been able to, because this album is still kind of all over the place. It goes from It's No Game, #1, where Bowie is screaming like we have never heard him scream before, just these guttural yelps in that song.
Yeah, he sounds drunk almost.
Yeah,
like the whole
and
thing
enraged.
sounds drunk and just prodding over itself. You know?
And then he goes into Up the Hill Backwards, which at first I didn't really like. This is another one like Lodger I didn't really like at first.
Oh, it's a track pick for me.
And I ended up loving it.
Yeah, it has that poppy, vocal chorus throughout, which is the majority of the song, but it has that huge guitar solo in there.
Yep. And it also has that main riff in like 7/4 time, which is a little odd. We don't really see Bowie mess around with time signatures a whole lot, but it's kind of cool to hear in that song, and that's definitely, for a mainstream success of an album, kind of a cool attribute to have in there.
One thing on this song really quick, Tom, that I want to throw out there is I think to me, I was really impressed with the production on Scary Monsters and Super Creeps, and I think the Up the Hill Backwards is a really great example of that. You hear in the drums, they're just doing something really interesting. Tom, maybe you can shed more light into this, but the drums almost sound truncated a bit and like clipped a bit, and it's just a really interesting drum sound, and you hear Bowie doing different things in the production throughout this record that I think are just ahead of its time. It's stuff that you hear artists experimenting with today. In 2018, you hear artists messing around with production and drums like this. So, like, to me, and the fact that this was, almost 30 years ago or almost 40 years ago is just crazy to me.
Yeah, I do have a comment on that. So I don't know too much in particular about the drum approach on this album, but I would credit that to just Bowie's knack for arrangement, as well as Tony Visconti being at the production helm again. We heard a lot of his production skills on the drums in Low, which was a highlight of that album, and I think he's doing some of those same things here. Part of that also, though, is, and this is more of a retrospective comment, this is more of a historically revisionist comment, but the common theme that I hear in this album with Lodger that came before it is both of these albums I see as influencing a lot of 90s music in Britpop, but also in industrial.
Yes.
Like on the title track, the guitar and the drum approach, to me, almost foreshadows things we would hear from anywhere from Nine Inch Nails to Orgy to Marilyn Manson. Just that aggressive kind of industrial guitar, and that percussive approach that is kind of syncopated and kind of clipped, and like it sounds kind of unnatural, but you could still picture it being performed in a way. That's something that I think is really cool on this album, because it blends that the very synthetic sounds with something that also feels very primal in the way that it was written and calculated out. So you definitely hear that on the drums and Up the Hill Backwards. You hear that all over on the title track. And also in Fashion, which is kind of a neat track because it's kind of abrasive, but also very poppy. All of this to me would kind of foreshadow almost, industrial music creeping its way into the mainstream. But then on the back half of the album, songs like Teenage Wildlife, which is a little more melodic, could have fit more on Lodger. Also, Because You're Young is a highlight for me. Really the only low low point on this album a little bit for me, which is still, the more I listen to it, the last listen I gave to this album, I ended up liking this track more, actually, but Scream Like a Baby isn't really a high point for me. I like some of the effects they do with like the like crossing pitch-shifted vocals in the bridge and just some of the general sounds, but from a songwriting perspective, that, and then Kingdom Come, the Tom Verlaine cover
Yep.
at track 8. You know, David Bowie is hit or miss with covers, as we've seen and will continue to see. And I think that one's pretty good, but...
Yeah, I agree. That was, like, both of those tracks, I think, were kind of the low point on this album. And if anything, that's what brought it below Lodger for me, because, like, I really like a number of the tracks on this record, specifically Ashes to Ashes, which that hit number 1 on the charts before the album was even released. And it's totally, you know, you get a Major Tom reference there. You kind of a return to form for Bowie. So, and I think that song really embodies kind of the soul of Scary Monsters and Super Creeps, in that this placated to all the fans Bowie had early on in his career, and then what he had grown into the more experimental stuff and the fans that he had picked up there with the Berlin trilogy. So this really, I did think, like, did a great job of just summing up the embodiment of his work at this point.
Yeah. I think that this album displays a few traits that are key in a great Bowie album, and that's a sense of purpose, a sense of identity, and a sense of confidence. This album has all of those things. Everything he does on this album, he does confidently. He does just balls to the wall with those vocal performances, with just like some of the, almost rash decisions in the guitars and how abrasive some pieces are. But there's also a purpose to it, and there's a sense of identity to it. Like, you feel like he went into this album knowing who he was and what he wanted to accomplish. And those are the Bowie albums that I think work. I think some of the ones that we'll see that don't really work for him are where he's a little wishy-washy and he doesn't really know what he wants to do, and he wants to be commercially successful, and he just wants things to sound good but not really to work on the songs themselves. And I think that's going to bring us into some of the future albums that we'll be talking about.
Yeah, to tie a bow on Scary Monsters, I think that this one, like, if there's one thing that we could underscore about this record, it's Robert Fripp's guitar work, and I think a lot of the guitar performances in my notes here, I just see nothing but just great guitar solo, amazing guitar solo on almost all of these tracks. There's just great guitar performances going on in the songwriting, and I think that's a really key thing about this record. Everything about this, Tom, to reiterate what you just said, it's Bowie putting every bit of who he is as an artist out there on display on this record, and he did have commercial success, but with doing that, to go back to no other record besides Scary Monsters and Ziggy Stardust really were able to achieve that. And I think that that's really important as we move out of, as I said earlier, this is kind of known as David Bowie's last truly great album.
Okay, Jake, put on your oxygen tank or whatever you need to
and
get
dance
through
the blues.
the rest of. Put on your oxygen tank and.
I hope that's really the lyric. I hope it is.
Because he's in space, right? No, he's not.
Serious moonlight.
He's not in space anymore. David Bowie is very much on the ground in Earth, in New York City, actually, again, recording his 1983 album, Let's Dance, which is what we're going to talk about right now. Let's Dance finds David Bowie at another peak of commercial success, and I think he wanted to ride this wave out as long as he could. So he went to New York. He got Nile Rodgers of Chic and disco fame to produce this album for him. And actually, I guess there was some bad blood there, because Tony Visconti thought he was going to produce this one again, and David Bowie kind of went behind his back and went with another guy. So I think that's kind of a shame, because I love the work that he did with Tony Visconti. So for Let's Dance, definitely he was going for a more commercial sound yet again. Instead of Robert Fripp on the guitar, he got Stevie Ray Vaughan on guitar on this one, which listen, Stevie Ray Vaughan is one of the most amazing guitarists in the history of guitar playing, and this was in his early years, early years which were cut far too short. But I gotta say, to dive right into it here, Jake, I don't feel like the guitar makes as big of an impact on this album.
Well, certainly not as the last two albums, which were really, the whole sound composition was built around the guitar. Mm-hmm. Here, it's not built around the guitar. It's built around kind of the synthy melodies and beats. The guitar is just accent. Yep. I think the whole point of Let's Dance is to take a pop sound. Bowie was deliberately, he had some success on Scary Monsters. And at this point, he wanted to make something that was popular. He had gone off the deep end with the Berlin trilogy, finally had a little bit of success with Scary Monsters again. And while Bowie was this music icon at this time, he wasn't exactly well off. There's reports of Bowie being, living on pocket change throughout some of the records that we've covered here. So he hasn't really, he's made a lot of money, but because of some things that are going on the side with business managers and lawsuits and things like that, he hasn't really hit it big from a financial perspective yet. So you can kind of understand that at this point, he's had a little bit of success off Scary Monsters and wants to get more of that. And so he aimed with Let's Dance to make a more poppy, accessible sounding record that is still Bowie, but he wanted to stretch his sound and be as flamboyant and absurd as possible. Just shoving in all of these synth beats and melodies, and then also mixing it in, why not, with Stevie Ray Vaughan blues guitar. What in what world does that make sense? And frankly, that's what kind of makes it work. Like, he was trying to do something new and unique and experimental. It ended up being very commercially successful with a number of very, very popular singles. I think Let's Dance, track 3 on this record and the title track on this record, is his most popular song ever, right?
Yeah.
It has to be. And frankly, how could it not be? It's a very well written song. But the whole sound of this record is meant to be absurd, and it just kind of ended up defining a whole genre of music, which embodied the mid 1980s.
Yeah, I find this album, because of what you just described, Jake, which is the absurdity in the fact that things just don't really mesh. He's taking oil and water and trying to make it work. For that reason, I find it kind of frustrating. But at the same time, as frustrating as this album is to me at times, I enjoy it more than I'm frustrated by it. It's still pretty good. But there's some stuff that happens on here that I just have to shake my head at. I do think, the beats sound very good. Like, when Modern Love, the opening track, kicks in, man, that beat sounds thick. That kick and that snare drum, and I actually like that song a lot. It goes into China Girl, which I think has mixed success. That's an album they pulled back from Iggy Pop's album, The Idiot, which David Bowie produced and helped write with Iggy Pop. They were working on a lot of stuff through these days. That song's okay, but it's a little sappy. Same thing with Without You. It's not bad, but it's not a bad song, but it more just, to me, it feels like it bastardizes the David Bowie persona and what I know of him to be as a confident and experimental and unrelenting musical mind. I think it compromises some of that. But the other pieces that really frustrate me here, so I'm going to air my grievances to begin with, because I think there's a lot of good things on this album that then are just ruined for me by these points of irritation. And those points of irritation are, in track 5, Ricochet. That song goes along really well. And
Ricochet!
That it's not the end of the world. That part, It sounds so awkward, and the vocal layers are obnoxious, and it's not even like at the same tempo as the rest of the song. It's like this dropout where they speed the tempo and like try to fit all these words into this little space of time, and it sounds so awkward.
Tom, that's the sonic waves ricocheting off the walls, man.
No. Go home, coked out David Bowie. Actually, I'd prefer coked out David Bowie at this point.
Yeah, I don't know if he was on coke at this one. I think he was pretty lucid.
I don't think so. So my other couple of irritations: cat people putting out fire. Look, this is a really nitpicky.
That's a track pick of mine.
Really, this is. I'm gonna get really bitchy for a moment. Okay. The whole putting out fire with gasoline thing is just stupid. It's a stupid line. Here's the deal. You can't put out fire with gasoline. Everyone knows that gasoline makes fires bigger. I would accept this on two premises. I know what he's going for. He's trying to be edgy. I'm putting out fire with gasoline, man. I'm edgy. I'm cool. I would accept it if he said, I'm putting gasoline on the flames, or I'm adding fuel to the fire. I'm putting gas on the fire, because we all know what that means. I would take it if he said, I'm trying to put fire out with gasoline. But he's saying
What if he said, give me fuel, give me fire, give me that which I desire?
Well, at that point, he'd just be ahead of his time.
Right.
No. But he's actually saying that he's putting out the fire with gasoline. No, you can't do that. It doesn't work. Chemically, it doesn't work that way. It just, look, I know that I'm being really, really stupid in calling that out, but it just bothers me. Like, he says it like it's some kind of badass rock line, like he's freaking David Lee Roth or something. Like, no, it's a fine song otherwise. It's fine. But then the worst of all, man, the worst of all is in the closing track.
Shake It is awful. It is the worst song.
The Shake It, What's My Line, sung in that high falsetto with like multiple layers. Every time that comes in, I want to claw my ears out. It visibly like you will get a visible reaction from me when that comes on. It is just claws on a chalkboard to me. And the thing is really only one little part of the song, but I find with several of these songs,
the whole song is awful.
Oh, really? See, the rest of it doesn't bother me as much, but it's just, I just hyper focus on that one thing and it just destroys it for me.
Yeah, to sum up, I think everything you're saying is that Let's Dance is Bowie trying to be poppy, trying to be accessible, still being Bowie and experimental, but just going a wholly different direction. Which I actually don't mind when artists do that. I applaud it. The thing is that you got to back it up with great songwriting, and here there's just so much track disparity. I think you have a handful of tracks that are higher quality, still don't live up to anything that he did before. Even Let's Dance, his most popular song and the title track on this record, I don't think is one of his better songs, honestly.
No, I agree.
I wouldn't even put it in the top like 20 or 30. But still, I mean, like it's one of the better songs on this record, but that just shows you how much of a step down this is from any of the previous albums since his debut. Nevertheless, this album sold incredibly well, and Bowie launched a huge tour after Let's Dance was released. The Serious Moonlight Tour goes all over the world, tours this album, and gets a lot of acclaim for it, and garners himself a whole new cohort of fans from Let's Dance, in addition to all the financial gains that he got on this one. So, for what it is, it's not going to be one of the best Bowie albums, but it is a landmark album in what it achieved for David Bowie at this point of his career.
Yeah. I think that's the best way to sum it up, Jake, is right. Because, I harped a lot on this album. I complained a lot. But I somehow still enjoy this album for the most part when it's on. I will say that. It's not one I'm going to come back to a whole lot. But if you put it on, I'd complain about those few things. But really, there's some decent stuff on here.
I personally put this under Young Americans.
I would too, yeah. So now we can go on to 1984, just a little bit over a year after the release of the hugely successful Let's Dance. We have David Bowie's 1984 album, Tonight. I had never listened to this album before preparing for this podcast, Jake.
Do you now know why?
Yes, I do. I think this easily has to be the worst album we've heard from him since his debut.
Agreed. I agree.
Now, I will say, I think that this album Stockholm Syndromed me a little bit because when I listened to it enough, like I warmed up to it enough, honestly, there besides the cover of God Only Knows by the Beach Boys that's on here, which we'll talk about in more detail in a minute, there's nothing on this album that like actively bothers me like some of the things that I mentioned on Let's Dance. But as an album, it just doesn't justify its own existence. It doesn't really accomplish much. Its biggest offense is just it's a very blah, uninspired album. It's really David Bowie just trying to ride the success from Let's Dance. He wanted to put out another album that had a similar enough aesthetic and put it out really quickly so that he could keep riding this wave that
he went on the record as saying that for Tonight and the next album that we'll talk about later, Never Let Me Down, he's actually just trying to please the new fans that he gained with Let's Dance. And anytime a band goes chasing their fans, I really just don't have a lot of respect for that move. That's not a visionary move, and I generally like music that's visionary and original, and simply this isn't. This was, David Bowie has always been a bit of a chameleon, and he plays, he's always a leader in the sound of the time, and Tonight is very much in the sound of that mid-'80s pop music movement that was happening. And I will say, like, one of the things that I think just inherently frustrates me is with Bowie's fascination with 1984, back in the 70s when he was in the Ziggy Stardust days. You would think that in the year 1984, he would release something somewhat related to 1984. Nope, not at all. This is about as far from that motif as you could get. What you have here is just a general sound palette that consists of a lot of bass and electric 80s drums. You get electric guitar, but it's only accent electric guitar. Lots of horn usage on this record. You get some saxophone, a lot of claves, and really flamboyant vocals soaked in reverb throughout this record. Tom, I will say that there were a couple of tracks on here that I want to call out. Neighborhood Threat and Blue Jean, track 5 and 6 on this album. Very definitively 80s songs, but I think that Bowie actually does a good job in the songwriting. Not some of my favorite Bowie tracks, but highlights on this record. And then track 8, I Keep Forgetting, has a really funky beat that gets stuck in my head. 80s drums, reverb vocals. It's very 80s, and so I have to chew on it a bit, I feel like, but I still found myself enjoying it. This isn't offensively bad, and I think that the back half is significantly better than the first half of this record.
Totally agree. Yeah.
But all in all, this it's such a step down for Bowie, who at this point we've just grown to expect more out of.
Mm-hmm. And I think that expectation and letdown is a big part of this. I really agree with everything you said, Jake. I think the back half is better. Neighborhood Threat and Blue Jean, I would even add Tumble and Twirl as that kind of trio of songs.
I like that song too.
That song was all right. The front half, I like the opening track, Loving the Alien, decently, but then the rest of side 1 with Don't Look Down, the Beach Boys cover, God Only Knows, which is just overwrought. I have trouble deciding whether I hate that cover or his Across the Universe cover more.
It's Across the Universe for me, for
Across
sure.
the Universe for you. I actually posted that quandary on Facebook, and someone had responded and said Across the Universe was definitely the bigger offender because it ruined an otherwise pretty well acceptable album. Whereas Tonight, it's like, who cares? It's a stinker track in the middle of a kind of a stinker album. Right.
Perfect
And
point.
I think that's really fair. But on their own, I think they're both pretty bad covers. Don't Look Down has this just kind of like faux 80s reggae feel that I don't really like. And then Tonight, the duet with Tina Turner, just feels so cheesy. And really, though, from a conceptual standpoint, what I hate in practice about this album, and we even saw this, a little bit on Let's Dance, in the sense that he pulled in China Girl from Iggy Pop's repertoire. David Bowie had been working with Iggy Pop for several years now, and there are several songs on this album that he just straight ripped from Iggy Pop albums, because he knew that he could make them more popular, and that way he didn't have to write as many songs for his new album before he could put it out and make a bunch of money. Like, that feels like a crap move to me. Don't Look Down is sorry, go ahead.
No, like the music on this album, it feels cheap and lazy.
Exactly. He pulled Don't Look Down from an Iggy Pop album. He pulled Tonight and Neighborhood Threat from Iggy Pop's Lust for Life album. Now, to give Bowie some credit, he did co-write those songs with Iggy Pop. Iggy Pop also performs on the last track on this album, Dancing with the Big Boys, which he co-wrote with them as well. But it's like, if those songs already exist, if they're already out there, they already have an identity on those Iggy Pop albums. Like, it's clearly just him trying to cash in as quickly as possible. And you know what? He did. Somehow this album, again, just riding the success of Let's Dance like he knew it would, it went to number one. It was hugely successful. But it just feels like a cheap move.
All right. Moving on to 1987 and the last album in David Bowie Deep Dive Part 2 for Velocities in Music, we have Never Let Me Down. What is this, Tom? His 16th album? Something like that?
17th.
17th. How do you even keep track at this point?
Right.
Interesting note about 1987. 1987 is my birth year. Did you know?
Oh,
did you know? Well, now you do.
Actually, I did know that.
This album came out the year I was born, and it sounds like an album that came out the year I was born 30 years ago.
Yep.
And very, very much just kind of continues the trend that we heard David Bowie start embracing on Let's Dance, and then obviously bastardize on Tonight. He's continuing that forward, but it's three years into the future. You hear a little bit of evolution in the sound, both in the production and in the songwriting. One noticeable change on this album is you hear the production shift towards more thick, washy synths and with a lot of guitar effects. And then you have a lot of faster paced beats used throughout this record. Borderline kind of techno-y. It kind of reminds me of stuff that he does later in his solo career, which we'll cover in part 3 on albums like Earthling. So that's kind of an interesting development. In general, that's one songwriting trope from the 1980s that I kind of like, is the faster paced electronic beat. And that's been, that's a trope that gets reused in modern albums all the time. And when done right, I think it can really sound well. On Never Let Me Down, I will say he does that a bit to an extreme. A lot of these songs follow a similar sonic palette here. Day in and day out, some of the things, day in, day out's the opening song, and right on that opening track, you hear a huge chorus. Fat beat, huge chorus, huge production. Bowie is flamboyant. He's throwing his heart out into this thing. Whereas Tonight it felt kind of lazy at times. Never Let Me Down seems very intentional. It's Bowie trying to make a good pop 80s album, and he's really putting everything he has into it at the time. But it's kind of a tired sound, especially now, 30 plus years removed from this album. It does feel a little bit tired. But I think at the time, there's some really good things going on here. Tom, I'll turn it over to you here in a second before I talk about my 2 track picks on this record, which are track 2, Time Will Crawl, which has this really, I think, a really great chord progression in key melody there. Kind of a little bit of a repetitive vocal melody, but I really like just the overall Time Will Crawl, like just how that song sounds. And then Beat of Your Drum and the overt sexualism of that song, I think, is just too catchy not to fall in love with. There's some other tracks on this record that are kind of hit and miss for me, but those two stand out as highlights.
Yeah, those two, I was going to add Never Let Me Down, those run of tracks, tracks 2, 3, and 4, the two you just mentioned, and then the title track at the end of that trio there, are definitely my favorite tracks on the album. And it does have a little bit more of an energetic rock feel to it, but it's rock, quote unquote, for what rock was in 1987, commercial rock music. I do like that there's a bit more energy. At first, being that I hadn't listened to Tonight or Never Let Me Down before going into this excursion and preparing for this podcast, at first I kind of just disliked both of those albums as much as each other. I ended up coming up on both of them a little bit, but I ended up liking Never Let Me Down a bit more than Tonight. I do think it's a better album overall. My biggest complaint is the last 4 tracks just kind of fall off for me. I think it is front heavy. We both called out, Jake, that our favorite tracks were within the first 4 or 5 songs there. I think Zeros is okay. I think Glass Spider's kind of an interesting experiment with spoken word storytelling.
Yeah, the first part of that is this synth soundscape, and then David Bowie kind of telling the story about the glass spider, right? And then when the song actually kicks in halfway through, it's actually a really good song, but you have to get through kind of that first little story bit, which is a bit hokey, bit Thriller-esque there.
Yeah. And then the rest of the album, I think, kind of falls off from there. It just becomes kind of bland and forgettable. I think, honestly, from Tonight, this album felt like a step in the right direction, but not a very strong step.
I completely agree with that assessment.
It's an improvement. He's still got Carlos Alomar on the guitar. That guy's been there through all of this somehow. One of the few people, and I think that he shines on some tracks, like the title track. But once again, he's also pulling an Iggy Pop song on the closing track, Bang Bang. It still just feels like, not necessarily that he's phoned it in, but that he's struggling to find what he is now. He doesn't have a strong sense of identity. He doesn't have a strong sense of purpose. And what he would do from there in the 80s to try to counteract that is a couple years later, he'll put out the album Tin Machine with his short-lived band Tin Machine, which is more of a rock, band-oriented sound. I'm glad that, he didn't just decide to call that a David Bowie album, because it does feel like a sidestep. And, moving into the 90s, which of course we'll cover on our next set, we'll see that sound kind of bleed into what he's doing there, or at least allow him to clear his mind. But, Never Let Me Down is by no means a very good album. I don't think we can really call it a very standout David Bowie album, but some of those tracks did stick with me, the ones that we called out, Jake, and I think that there's some decent things to be said about this, but it's just such a simple, straightforward album. I don't really know what more to say that we haven't already said.
And that's a fair point. I think that one thing I'd like to throw out there is if you took which sonically I think Tonight and Never Let Me Down are sister albums, even though that they're 3 years apart, and were some subtle sonic differences between them. Really, overall, they achieved effectively the same thing.
Yeah.
In that they're kind of continuing on the riding the wave of popularity and poppiness of Let's Dance. I think if you were to take all of the track highlights from Tonight and Never Let Me Down, I think that you would have a pretty good David Bowie pop-obsessed 1980s era sort of record. Mm-hmm. But that's the point, is that it would take you'd have to take the highlights of both of these records, and then it still wouldn't be as good as any album that came before it, with maybe the exception of one, his self-titled record, his first record. So I just think that that is just an obvious sign that of kind of a lull in his songwriting, a lull in his career from an artistic standpoint. Certainly not from a sales standpoint, as these sold better than anything else he's done since some of his earlier work. So that it's kind of an interesting way to end this set, kind of on a low note, because I personally didn't like Tonight, and Never Let Me Down I liked more than Tonight. But these I would rank very, very much below all of the other Bowie records we've covered so far in part 1 and part 2. And
Yeah.
Tom, we're through 17 albums of 26 at this
Can't
point.
believe it, man. I'm ready to dive into the next 9, the final 9.
Yeah. Final 9. So in part 3, we will cover the 90s, the 2000s, and the 2010s up to David Bowie's last album, which came out in January of 2016, Black Star, right before his untimely death. So we're excited to wrap up Bowie. I've been listening to Bowie throughout 2018 at this point, and would like to move on to some other artists at this point. But there's a lot of actually the next section of Bowie albums. I've listened to Earthling, The Next Day, and Black Star, obviously, but I haven't listened to any other Bowie albums in this set. So this will be certainly a learning experience for me. I wish I knew some of the other albums that were in this set, so I'm excited to dive into it.
Right there with you. You want to rank these?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So I'm going to try to run through these here off the top of my head. Station to Station. I love that album. I think it's a masterpiece. I'm giving that an A+. Low, I think, is just a small step below that. I'm giving that a solid A. I really like that album, but it's just not quite perfect to me. Heroes, like I said, I struggle with that one a little bit. I'm going to give that like C+ range.
Oh, you're not going in order, I see.
I'm going in chronological order.
Okay.
So then we'll go from Heroes to Lodger. Lodger I really liked. I think I'm going to give that one probably like a B+, A- range, somewhere on that line. Scary Monsters, I think I'm going to give a solid A-. Let's Dance, I'm going to give, let's see, how would I compare it to Heroes? I think I still like Heroes better. I can't say that Let's Dance is a better album than Heroes, God. So I think I'm going to give Let's Dance a C. And then I'm going to give Tonight a D, and I'm going to give Never Let Me Down a C-. That's where I'm sitting.
You know what you get? F+. All right, I'll start with Station to Station and follow your lead here. Chronological order. Station to Station, I'll give an A-. A-.
All right.
I can see that one. I will say this: Station to Station is one of those albums I am going to come back to numerous times. There's a lot in this set.
Whenever you get to hang out with me next.
Well, right, for sure. Here's the thing about this set. I went into this set thinking that I wouldn't like most of these albums, and I ended up loving many of them. Mm-hmm. So I in general, I like this set far more than I expected. It definitely exceeded my expectations. So starting with Station to Station, I will give that an A-. Going from Station to Station to Low, I would give Low a B+, Heroes a B. Then moving from Heroes into Lodger, I would give Lodger a solid A. Scary Monsters, I would go A-. Then going to Let's Dance, I would give a C. Never Let Me Down. I'm sorry, I'll go to Tonight after that. Tonight, I would give a D+, and Never Let Me Down, I'd give a C-.
Okay. So we're actually fairly close.
We are. And considering that we didn't talk about this at all, I'm pretty amazed by that, actually.
Yeah, me too. Because there is a lot of opportunity for us to converge. I mean, or diverge, really. I think that, from the sound of it, I like Station to Station and Low a little bit more than you. I've also been listening to those albums for years. I already have kind of an emotional attachment to them. But I think it's really cool to hear you liked Lodger so much, and even, a bit more than I did. That's really cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I have it I have them in tiers, and I have Lodger right in the same tier as Diamond Dogs and Aladdin Sane, which were albums that I didn't expect to like but fell in love with from set 1. So, all right, Bowie fans, what is your favorite Bowie album that we've covered in either part 1 or part 2? How does the Berlin trilogy and the albums that we covered tonight in part 2, how did those measure up in your favorite Bowie albums list? Let us know. Tom and I would love to hear your opinions. Thank you guys for your continued support and participation. Tom and I love all of your comments on our YouTube videos, your Facebook messages, and your emails to us. Your participation is what makes Velocities in Music possible, so as always, thank you for being awesome. I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
We are Velocities in Music, moving music discussion forward.